This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Katarina Fetter, Vice President and Director of Business Development at Artists' Rights Society, an organization which has spent more than 35 years guiding artists through the often obscure realm of copyright and intellectual property matters by providing licensing expertise, legal support, advocacy, and educational outreach. ARS works on behalf of artists to manage the licensing of works of art for editorial and commercial purposes with museums, auction houses, scholars, publishers, galleries, ad agencies, production companies, and other educational and commercial entities. In addition to her role at ARS, Katarina is also co-founder and CEO of ARSNL, which focuses on artist licensing for the blockchain. And now, a conversation all about protecting the IP of artists with Katarina Fetter. Katarina Fetter, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Katarina, you're the Vice President and Director of Business Development at Artists' Rights Society and co-founder of ARSNL, which focuses on artist licensing for the blockchain. And so this is an interesting world that is always a little bit beyond my grasp in terms of what's going on in the world of licensing. So I've really been looking forward to our conversation. You know, a lot of times, Katarina, when I have folks on, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, say you were sitting at a dinner party next to somebody who has absolutely no idea who you are or what ARS does. How do you start to describe to them what you guys do?
First of all, thank you so much, Craig, for having me. Very, very excited to be here and speaking with you about all of this. Yeah, licensing can be a bit opaque, and I think it's because the concept of intellectual property, or copyright specifically here, is opaque itself. I guess if describing at a dinner party, what I would say is that Artists' Rights Society, we represent the intellectual property rights of 120,000 artists worldwide. It means we don't buy or sell their work. What we're actually working with is the underlying IP of their work. And when an artwork is created, hopefully it gets sold eventually, After that, it's out of the hands of the artist. They really have no rights for it, especially in the States, right? We don't have any resale royalties or anything like that. The only thing that they do have still to monetize and also just, to keep their affairs in order is their intellectual property. It's extremely important. Yesterday, I was actually lucky enough that Michaeline Thomas, she's a alumnus of Pratt, and she still works with them a bunch. And every year I do this thing with her called Pratt Forward for some of their graduate students. And we were speaking yesterday about all of this, about licensing. I'm sorry, now I've gotten off track. I'm not sure why I tied in Michaeline yesterday anecdotally. Anyway, to get back to it, so works just for the purpose of licensing the work. So your intellectual property, how you can monetize on it, how you could protect it, that could be for really any time your work is reproduced, whether for commercial or journalistic or scholarly purposes. Sometimes it's not going to be revenue generating, but to make sure that your copyright, etc., is all clear so that it is obvious that you own the work. And sorry, in some other layman's terms, I would really just say, think about absolutely any surface and how you could put art on it. Mm-hmm. There's a middleman that helps facilitate that process. That is Artists' Rights Society.
In this changing world, Artists' Rights Society was founded in 1987?
Yes.
And so in the last, give or take 40 years, there's been a whole evolution. I remember 1987, and the digital world just really didn't exist in 1987. Can you talk about how much more complex the landscape is for protecting an artist's rights now versus when the society was formed?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I was born 1 year after that in 1988. So while I wasn't there, I have been privy to, the goings on for a very, very long time, for decades. It's exactly as you're saying. I mean, the digital world has made it, at least up until now. Now in the last couple of years, there's been some promise of the opposite of this, but the digital world has made it absolutely impossible in some ways to keep track of all the information out there. Obviously, anybody can take a photo of an image in a museum or anywhere, post it online. People can falsely attribute things. All of this is just sort of par for the course. It has become, we do obviously within ARS a lot of DMCA takedowns. That's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That's if anything's on Etsy or Facebook being sold, etc. The good news is that big brands still and reputable brands, should they not license something, it's almost always done by accident, and they're very enthusiastic to have a retroactive license. It's really much more difficult when it comes to which is in some ways less of a threat, but it's the reality, like individual retailers and things like that. It is just impossible. And then we have also some things like, Alibaba, like there's just no way for us to get things down from Alibaba, no matter how much we try. We've been successful once in a while, but it's also a global world, one in which you can't necessarily make demands in certain countries, especially, China, to adhere to our standards. So it's definitely been a challenge, as you say.
Legally, I imagine the majority of the work you do is trying to control things in the US, but do you reach into Europe? And like you said, it seems like Asia would be a hard area to try to monitor and control because these are totally different legal landscapes that you're trying to work within, correct?
Yeah, so luckily structurally, when I say ARS represents 120,000 artists, that's accurate. But the way that it has compiled all these artists is not individually. We are part of a larger umbrella organization that's called CISAC, which is based in Paris, in France. And CISAC is a governing body that sort of oversees what they call collecting agencies worldwide. This is not just in the visual arts, by the way. We have sister societies here in the States that are BMI and ASCAP who do music licensing. But it's about 40 some of us that are in visual arts. So when one signs up with ARS in the US, they are immediately a member of and protected in other countries through that sister society. So we have a great sister society called JASPAR in Japan, for example. In Japan, the term of copyright is only 50 years after the death of an artist, while in the US, it's 70 years after the death of the artist. So those laws apply there, like we have 20 more years here than they do. But they are the experts on Japanese, law and copyright. It is not us who is dealing with all the finer points. Of course, with a country like China, they're just not adhering to these standards in general. So there is no, society there. It's just a culturally different thing. But yeah, there's about 44 of us around the world.
What does the process look like for you guys in terms of relationship building with artists? Are you at a point where artists are joining younger and younger? I mean, do you see that as a trend? Because in my mind, it's always been rather protecting the rights in that 70-year period that you speak of. But it seems like more and more artists are trying to control the licensing within their own lifetime.
Sure. I think that artists generally, and this is relevant to the class yesterday I taught with Mickaleen, they are much, much savvier than they were, whatever, in the decades past. I think obviously the dissemination of information, it's much easier now. There's tools to help that are not necessarily expensive. But beyond that, I think that there is a little bit more of an emphasis, perhaps within MFA programs, but maybe more largely with, just people helping you to actually understand art as a business, which I think maybe sometimes older generations of artists maybe thought that was a bit beneath them. Clearly not everyone. Warhol did not. And he is, essentially the grandfather of maybe everything we do when it comes to licensing.
Right.
But I think there has been a cultural shift in that. The problem or not the problem, the reality is with licensing is that, just to, again, take a maybe more bird's eye view of what we do at ARS, we do things that are hyper commercial, right? Like right now on the Samsung frame, you can get Dali images played, or you can buy, a bear brick with Magritte on it, or whatever, a clothing collaboration, so on and so forth. But we also do everything when it comes to editorial. That's for any sort of museum or magazine, exhibition catalog, etc. Anything that has an academic or scholarly purpose. So for that, it is absolutely, I think, behooves any artist to have all of that buttoned up. Most artists don't even know, for example, for auction houses, we have somebody on staff whose full-time job is just auction houses. And these are, agreements that are very long-standing with these auction houses, and a way that artists can get remunerated for, the works that are being advertised and presented in order to drive clients to the show, to the auction. So I think for every age, that is very important. When it comes to licensing in a more high-touch commercial way, the way that I'm saying, I think the unfortunate reality is, even though we do treat every artist completely agnostic of where they are in their career, and that's sort of part of our underlying rules with CZAC too, there is obviously much more power that an artist who is established has, no matter the age, than an artist who is less well known. Brands just want to, inherently work with sort of the lowest common denominator, in the sense that it's the person who most people on the street are going to have heard of, which I always think it's so funny when they say that, because an average person on the street, and no offense to them, there's many more important things to know, but they perhaps only know like Picasso, Dali, Matisse, if that. And that is sort of what, a lot of brands are most interested in. But I do think it is changing. And we do have a lot of skate brands and things that tend for younger. I mean, we spoke about the Ray Johnson estate. I know not younger at all, but something I loved was a collaboration that we did years ago. We've done many, but with a contemporary skate brand with Ray Johnson. And, there was like paparazzi photos of Justin Bieber wearing some of the pants. And that's just very cool to see, a newer generation maybe discovering an artist of an older generation. But that example is not exactly what you asked.
No, that's great. How does the next stage work? If somebody were interested in putting Frida Kahlo's face on a pillow, is there ever a case where what they want to do with the image is so outside the box that, there's kind of a refusal of rights? Or is it open to whoever wants to use an image as long as they're willing to pay the price? Does that question make sense?
It makes sense. I guess the answer is two-pronged. There isn't a pushback when it comes to editorial. And in fact, for most of our artists, we do that without even getting in touch with them. We remit the finances. But so this is when, a new art history 101 textbook is being published. They come to us with, a request of 500, 600, whatever works. We're doing all of that. There is no reason that the artist, would feel any way about it. When it comes to, use the example of a pillow, that's very different. And that is where artists really do, or their, representatives, their state or foundation, have very strong feelings about. I mean, I remember one estate, I won't name now, but I remember there was a lucrative sneaker collaboration, and they wanted to put the signature line on the sole, and they found that very offensive, for example. I mean, it's not something that I would have thought of as being offensive, but I understand their point. Some artists are very strict about, of course, no bleeding or things like that. But for the most part, I will say that they have gotten much more experimental and much more interested in doing collaborations that are of a more bespoke nature. I feel like even 15 years ago, it was very typical for a license to be really a still image on a t-shirt, and that was sort of the only way it was being done. And now that is extremely unusual for us to see. It is details, it is overlaying, and that was, I think, a shift as well. I think at first it was sort of almost I don't know, they were taken aback, especially older and European, estates and foundations. Whereas now I think they actually really see the merit in it, which, in addition to bringing in, financial revenue, which is wonderful, it also exposes you to a completely different audience. We really can't expect everyone. It's wonderful to go to museums, but you can't expect that to be what everyone is doing. And it's wonderful to have work disseminated in different ways, and also just to own something that feels like it's related to something that most of us will never, have the opportunity to own is also wonderful. Some estates, I will say, even like have us put, little like facts and stuff on the hanging tags. They like having things like that. So we have very specific. It's not just the image on I'm pointing right now to my sweater, but on anything, depending on what it is. It's also the hang tag, the interior tag, all of that is, and also all the advertising and marketing around it too. How many like impressions is this getting on Instagram and social media? What is like the web campaign? Is there bill stickings and stuff like that? Those are all, can be wrapped into one, but they're different licenses.
You mentioned earlier how it's sort of akin to BMI and ASCAP. And it makes me wonder, in the music business, artists do a lot of sampling. And there winds up being sometimes litigation about fair use, or did you pick up this riff consciously or subconsciously? And I'm just thinking about in terms of unintended collaborations where artists are borrowing visuals from artists that maybe their licensing is monitored or regulated by you guys. Do you ever find where you have to reach out to an artist that is maybe pulling a little too much from an artist that you guys represent?
Sure. In the past, when we've had to do that, and we've done it on behalf of very famous artists to other artists who just might not have, the contact information or something like that, there has never been a problem. I think the problems arise more when artists, and this is not really, when it gets to the point of licensing, it's before that. And it's interesting, again, I was having this conversation yesterday, but when artists don't ask for permission to use other artists' work. I don't know if you've had anyone on the podcast already speak about, the recent Warhol verdict. Right. But of course, just broadly to remind us all, as I said at the beginning of this, intellectual property is a very sort of opaque concept. And as is copyright, and there's no sort of definitive way of deciding whether someone should have ownership. De facto, when it is created, it is owned by you. But there is something called these 4 factors that are used. And each of these 4 factors are extremely subjective themselves. Like one is what percentage of the work is being used, but it's not really what percentage, how much, but it's not really about what percentage, it's about is at the heart of the work, which again is completely subjective. Well, one of these factors was the commercial viability of the work. Does it undermine the commercial viability of the original work? And in this case, the lower courts voted in favor of the Warhol Foundation, saying no, it didn't. And the Supreme Court, of course, voted in favor of Lynn Goldsmith, using that last, piece of it very heavily on this. I have seen through my studio, which is, as you said, ARSNL.art, or we like to say ARSNL.art, but who would know how to find it? So I appreciate us spelling it out. I have now had issues with artists who had not been freaked out before about the transformative work that they've done, about showing it now. These are usually artists who work in sort of this Warholian fashion, where they take maybe a photograph that was in the news or something like that, didn't necessarily get the journalist permission for it, manipulate it, but now, a precedent is set wherein that might not cut it as something that is transformative. So I've seen it from that side more. From a side of a brand collaboration, no, not as much. But I would recommend to any artist just to get in touch with. It's just, they usually, and again, I was speaking with Micheline Thomas yesterday, she gave an example to the class as well. I mean, it's almost always they just want acknowledgement and some recognition that this work was derived from them. The cost is almost always nominal. That's really not what they're looking for. And it's just so much smarter than having bad blood and potentially a lawsuit. How much can be avoided,
In July, I had an attorney, Dale Sandali, on the line, who is one of the foremost authorities on IP and copyright law. And we kind of did a 1-hour deep dive into fair use. And it just seems even murkier now than it did before. But no, you're right. Last year, I also spoke to Shepard Fairey, who his lawsuit with AP, which actually Dale Sandali was on the opposite side of the table from Shepard. It would have been a few $100s to license the Obama photo beforehand, but they were asking for something rather punitive on the opposite side of having used it without permission.
Absolutely. And he lost that case back then. So there was, there was precedent for the Warhol case. It was just never on at this level, at this stage. And I also think I'm supposed to say as well that Artist Rights Society represents the Andy Warhol Foundation. So I'm coming at it with some bias as well.
You mentioned ARSNL. Can you discuss more what your vision is for ARSNL and how you guys are responding to the advent of blockchain technology and NFTs? What do you see as the green field there?
Sure. So I was running business development for ARS for, a couple of years when I heard of blockchain technology, and I say I understood it is probably an overstatement, but I understood it more from the financial, what everyone was talking about, in the early days, from the Bitcoin and how this was a financial instrument. When it started, the explosion of NFTs started during COVID. First of all, what I think was very, very attractive and what's become very attractive to a lot of artists was this promise of resale royalties. Artist Rights Society has been the underwriter of the congressional bill that is called like the ARS2 Act, I believe. But basically, it's a resale royalty act that would be implemented. It's probably unrealistic that that will ever happen. It's just, again, culturally not something that's very American, although they did have it in California for a moment. It does not work to have it state by state, of course. But we feel like it's our, duty to, help finance that bill, and it has two, bipartisan sponsors on it. But that was a very, very attractive promise of NFTs. Another thing that just started happening was we're obviously on the receiving end of a lot of inquiries, and tons of platforms were getting in touch with us overnight. And many of these platforms really were just started in the last week, It's not to say that some of them didn't have brilliant people behind them, but they had absolutely no track record. And many of them really were asking to use art in ways that just our artists would not be interested in whatsoever. And it seemed like, okay, this is an interesting opportunity for us to do something. And then we were really lucky enough that the son of Frank Stella, his name is Peter Stella, he got in contact with me, and he had a very, very good idea. It really came from him as to a digital art project using this new technology. And we thought, let's start with that. And Frank, I will say as well, has been a huge proponent of resale royalty. He has spoken about it with ARS, for years, and has lectured on the topic at law schools, etc. So that for him was very exciting. And I think for his son and all the rest, it was just exciting to share this work in a different way. So that's really how it came about.
Well, how does your work look different navigating the world of blockchain and NFTs than in the legacy art world?
The NFT art world is more open. I was about to say more fun. The traditional art world can at times be fun, but it's fun that's it's a different sort of, it's much more formal. It's much more, use the word legacy. It's much more sort of legacy based. The barriers to entry are a lot higher. There's a lot of kind of pomp and circumstance. And honestly, even for me, who I spent some time as a theater actress, I'm not nervous in front of crowds. It takes years sometimes to get comfortable around these people, and that's sort of the face that it puts on, right? This is not by accident. The NFT art world, if you will, this is a very different group of people. Actually a really brilliant group of people, I will say. I think that maybe from the outside, especially at the onset of things, it seemed like, I know degen is actually a term, but that it did just seem like, a bunch of degenerates hanging around their computers all day. I'm blown away by the level of intelligence of the average person, working in the NFT kind of fine art sector. They're usually people who come from some fine art background with a tech background, or at least very interested. I unfortunately don't have a tech background, but my partner does, who is brilliant. Just people who are interested in sort of pushing the boundaries and trying different things, and maybe aren't coming at it in as intimidated of a way, so more likely to ask to do things that we're kind of told in the traditional art world, what, you can't just get in touch with that curator. You can't just, right, cold call that artist. I think there's a bit more of an enterprising and new spirit within the NFT fine art community. I've really had so much fun with it. And, a couple of years ago, I've always said this, I'm going to say it again, is that I don't know any artists who are really anti-NFTs. It's always been just art world people who are anti-NFTs. And I think it makes sense, right? It's just like one of the cryptocurrencies, speaking to friends in finance here in New York, and they were so adamant against it. It's like, well, there's something there clearly that's threatening you. Otherwise, you would not be bothering, if these were, I don't know, whatever pebbles that people were using instead, you would not have as big of a problem with it. Same with like schlocky art. No one really cares that there's bad art out there. But for some reason with NFTs, it was like, oh my God, just the end of, culture and know it and all of the rest. It threatens, the old establishment. So yeah, younger, more fun. But, a lot of museums now have really like, I don't think they mind my saying this because I'm singing their praises. I've been speaking a bunch with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who recently brought in, I'm so sorry, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but an individual who was before that at Blue Cadet, which is sort of this experiential, I think they probably did a commission for the Met, but they brought him on as full time to be thinking about these new things and, how to show the works, maybe, not with people who are not in the museum. How are there's going to be the modern and contemporary wing is down now for a couple years. How can you keep people engaged with that material? So if, museums like the Met are thinking about it, you can imagine that most are. And I think that's really amazing. And I'll say also, sorry, it's a bit off topic, but yesterday I went to the MoMA for an event at night. So it was closed besides one gallery. And I saw the rehang of This Was the Fifth Floor, and I was just blown away. It was the best I had ever seen the museum. So much more interesting that I don't know if you remember years ago, there was this big, there was this move to have younger curators at museums, and everyone thought it was just going to be, nonsense and all that. It is so interesting and engaging, and you'll have like a masterpiece next to an object that's everyday use object or anonymous Polaroids taken, but I mean it's to teach people about when the camera became more accessible and furniture intermixed with sculptures. And anyway, it's all to say that I think the old establishment is modernizing, maybe not at the pace that satisfies everyone, but they're at least the MoMA, I think, has knocked it out of the park what they did. So things are changing regardless.
I think I first saw that when the Rijksmuseum rehung their collection like 5 or 6 years ago, and I've seen it at the Met. I had Daniel Weiss, who was the CEO of the Met, on about a year and a half ago, and we were discussing how moving from art being displayed along a timeline to art being displayed in terms of how these works interrelate across time. In the Met, I know that there are some contemporary African-American works hung alongside John Singer Sargent, and there's a dialogue now.
Out Elizabeth Columba, a great artist that we represent, who is contemporary, who is literally right next to Singer Sargent. And I was just so blown away when I saw that. I mean, just surrounded by works that are hundreds of years old and masterpieces, hers fits in seamlessly with it. I'll say also, like, thematically, I mean, that makes much more sense from a licensing perspective too, which I understand is not the way the museum should hang their works necessarily. But it does, the same logic applies, I mean, you don't present it in a period. That makes no sense. It's more what the works are and what the client is trying to capture. And that thematically is what we present, not, a decade that has nothing to do with it.
We were talking earlier about, representing your artists as they move into the NFT world. And I know I recognized some names on your list that have done NFT projects, like Matt Kalashaw, who I've had on the podcast, John Gerard, who I've had on the podcast, John's done a number of projects with Pace Verso. Are you only inserting yourself into projects that you originate, or if someone like John Gerard, who's on your roster and who is also on a particular gallery roster, and that gallery is now offering NFT through, for example, like Pace Verso, are you involved in that transaction?
So we haven't been historically. We're rethinking now if we want to open it up to that. What we really are is a, full touch creative studio and marketplace. So the work, originates obviously with the artist, but there is a lot of, and especially working with a lot of, traditional artists, there is a lot of ideation that goes on with us just about how to capture. I mean, I usually start it the same way with everyone. Like, what would you want your work to do that it can't do right now? Mm-hmm. Not even thinking about the limitations that might be there. And let's, work backwards from there. If, by the way, there's nothing that technology can add to, for me, it's not that interesting of a project. And I would say for most blue chip artists, it's probably not the right way to go. You know what I mean? I think if you're more in an experimental phase, it's fine, but I think it's kind of perceived not well sometimes if it's not a really well conceived project. So, we're a small team. That's, by virtue of that only that we've done 5 projects. But not all of them were ARS artists. I'm happy to say that they signed up with ARS afterwards. But today was the culmination of a year-long project we did with an artist named Zebrin Versteeg, who was not an ARS artist then, is now. But this was an incredible Outland. One of their editors chose it as the best of the year NFT projects. And he is a digital artist. He's represented by Bitform's gallery. Who, has a fantastic roster of digital artists that they've been working with for, Steve has had his gallery for several decades now. And I believe we were introduced to him through Steve, through Bitforms. And he's always been working, in a digital medium. He uses sort of a lot of algorithmic scraping to create his artwork. And what we conceived of, but he had never worked on blockchain, by the way. So ever since he was getting his MFA, which was, not to give away his age, but he's not in his 20s, he's collected by the Guggenheim and all the rest. He's very well established. But he had never done anything on chain. And the part that interested him the most was the timely aspect of what can be done. So what we did with him is he already had an algorithm wherein he can scrape the internet for trending news stories, primarily off of Google. So here, what we did is we created 750 blank canvases, and people bought a blank canvas or multiple blank canvases, let's say. And for the duration of a year, his algorithm is creating new works. They're generated every, 5 to 10 minutes, give or take. I think it's like exactly 8 or something like that. And they exist on the site for about 2 hours. So there's like 9 works listed on the site. And after 2 hours, if nobody claims that work, remember, you get a blank canvas to begin with, then it disappears sort of forever. And in that way, these 750 that were then, claimed sort of become this year-in review of the last year, which Zebrin found extremely interesting.
Right.
So it didn't change really his practice much, the delivery and the conceptual nature of it. And I think blockchain is really great when it comes to conceptual art, I have to say.
Yeah.
For me, at least, more than retinal art. That's probably more of a taste thing. But I do like tactile objects. I don't like looking at a screen as much necessarily, except when it comes to conceptual delivery of things. I think that that's where, blockchain can be really, really interesting. So in short, we'll work with any artist, whether they are from ARS or whether they are not. We hope to represent them through ARS because they like what we do. But yeah, we're game to work with whoever. But we are not the type of marketplace, at least right now, that is open for anyone to list their works on. Right. Perhaps it would behoove us to be so, but we'll get there when we get there.
That work reminds me of Stefan Brueggemann, who I had on the podcast, who's doing an NFT very similar because he has a great portion of his work that's tied to media headlines and the last lines of movies. And so his work is always kind of reflecting, what's going on in society. But, one of the things that I find really interesting is that, like Pace Verso, I had Random International on the podcast to talk about a project they did with Pace Verso. And, the interesting thing there is that Random International creates these huge installations that are really only accessible to someone who has a giant foyer in their business tower or a museum. But when you start talking about creating an NFT experience based on, their conceptual practice, it makes their work more accessible to everyone else.
Absolutely.
Do you see that same sort of benefit for, some artists that just aren't able to otherwise reach a larger audience?
Oh, absolutely. And as well, things that just don't hold up in physics too. I mean, unfortunately, they didn't go with it, but perhaps maybe they'll change their mind one day. But we were speaking to an artist as well that we represent, the foundation, which is Frank Lloyd Wright. he has a whole city that he built, Broadacre City, that, if anybody feels like Googling, it's really worth it. The sketches are incredible for it. It's just not a city that can exist anywhere else but a place like the metaverse. That to me is what the most interesting is. Even with working with legacy, we have tended not to. I don't want to just reproduce Dali's and sell those as Dali NFTs. That is not, as interesting to me. But something like that. And actually, another organization did an interesting job, TR Labs, with the Chris Burden estate recently. Those were realized works as well. But when it comes to, as you're saying, space and also financial, I think that the Frank's show that we did with Frank Stella is a good example. His sculptures, depending on the size, are starting probably in the ballpark of $1 million. And I'm sure you get very small for less, but you know what I'm saying, $1 million and up. And I've seen these in person, they're absolutely enormous. There's a healthy audience for him, luckily, but that's still a small group of collectors who can afford and house these types of works. To be able to buy a Stella that is, and incidentally, the reason that these works were chosen, we didn't create these works with Frank. These were 22 works that had already been created digitally by Frank in his studio. Since he started working with sculpture in the late 80s, early 90s, he has always used computer-aided drafting to help him, and 3D printing as well, to help him in, we say he's the first. I'm sure there are other contemporaries of his, but I have not found anyone who was doing this before him. So we thought, what a fantastic way to tie that all in as well, which is to allow people to buy these, created but never fabricated works in additions, and give with them the 3D printing files so that they can print them at their own cost in whatever material they want to whatever size they want as well. They were $500 during pre-sale, $1,000 during sale. You could easily spend, $50 printing one. You could spend $50,000 printing one if you really wanted to have, something really monumental and fabulous on your lawn. And that to me has always been the most elegant example. We're so lucky to launch with such a big artist. So don't get me wrong, there's that. But really one of the more elegant examples of using traditional art with NFTs, because it was so simple and pure and brilliant. The whole thing was there already. We didn't have to attach any bells or whistles. The story just made complete sense to begin with. So yeah, I think that's an amazing way to use the technology.
Looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing issues facing artist rights in the future? Do you see trends that are opportunities or challenges?
Yeah, the big thing on everyone's, lips now is AI. That's sort of, the big existential threat. I don't know if anybody watched the Oscars, which were, on Sunday when we're recording this. But I also read an interview with Christopher Nolan when Oppenheimer was being released. And I think he has a very healthy, or at least at least publicly he does, healthy attitude about all of this, which is, this is within human control. It's the way that we choose to use it. It's just having us rise to the occasion of something to make, to refine our tools and make them better. It's a lovely way of thinking about it. I do understand why artists are, frustrated and nervous about it. We have been in talks with our law firm, and they have a law firm that they work with that does these bigger, what do I want to say, civil cases, class action, that does these bigger class action cases. And they've recently filed one on behalf of the Authors Guild. There's been talk of us filing one on behalf of visual artists. Part of the problem is it's much harder with visual artists than it is with writers, because works are copyrighted as soon as you create them, but to bring any sort of legal action with them, they have to actually pass through the Copyright Office, which most visual artists, and we've never encouraged them to do either, because, it's a great practice, but it's sort of unrealistic when you have sketches, maquettes, all of the rest. They're going to be sending all of them. Well, to be representative of the class, we need a certain amount of them that have all their work registered. Anyway, that aside, I'm trying to kind of, take a Nolan approach to it and think, what can this, because, without that, one is just doomed and will not leave their bedroom, which today I haven't, as you can see. So, that might be happening. But I started working at ARS, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. I went away to business school, came back, and was working in the capacity of business development. Nobody wanted to talk about copyright. Like, no, it's not that they could care less about copyright. And I was lucky when COVID was coming, ARTNet, probably could tell like everyone that they were going to need more content. And they could, at the time, I don't think they cared much about, copyright either. It was like, great, you'll write a column for us on copyright, whatever, like do so. So I spent years answering artist questions. It was 3 years I had a column where artists would write in questions about copyright. And they were really quite consistent for a long time. And then they started taking a sharp turn with NFTs and with blockchain. And with that came then all of these opportunities for me. I mean, of course, I launched my own thing off of ARS, which is ARSNL, but all of these opportunities to speak about copyright and about licensing in ways that nobody was interested in before. I mean, suddenly everyone wanted to understand what this was. And there was this fantastic promise that blockchain had of, are we really going to live in a world where digitally we have the same sort of ownership as we do in this world? I mean, that was such a trip, right, to think about. Suddenly we all need to start creating digital sneakers and beanies and, digitize everything, kind of sell it all there, whatever. And then the pendulum has swung the other way completely, which is AI, which is now the thought is that, to go back to our 4 factors, one of those factors is it sufficiently transformed, So in the case we said with Warhol, I guess, the ruling is finding it is not sufficiently transformed, that Goldsmith photograph to this. What the AI companies claim, and they're right, by the way, in some ways, and I'll tell you where there's exceptions, but is that anything that's coming out, if I'm going to say, Picasso, The Simpsons, and whatever, a baguette, I'm not sure why that came to mind. Whatever comes out, going to be a transformative, right? No one's, that's not close enough. Anyone can create a cubist work, right? Picasso doesn't own, or at least it doesn't own cubism itself. What does happen sometimes, however, I will say, is that signatures get scraped, which I think is problematic. But the thing that I think is very frustrating to artists is the ingestion itself. It seems very unfair that they are not being in some way, paid for the ingestion, for lack of better terms. I'm trying to think of a more elegant way to say that, remunerated. They're not being remunerated for that ingestion. That I think is very frustrating and scary. And I don't think that AI is going to take the place of, quote unquote, fine artists. I think that there'll still be an appetite for it, but I really do understand for artists. And by the way, all fine artists also, most of them have to work jobs in other ways to support themselves, many visually. And I do see how it's a real threat to a working artist, as in somebody who's doing work for hire, storyboarding, illustration, anything like that. I can understand how this is very disquieting, all of this, and how somehow, it's being trained on their models. And it's just, again, it is wild that it went from one direction to the other. That swing to me indicates something larger. It indicates that we're at some sort of point here where we are reckoning with all of this junk that we have collected collectively over the last 30 plus years and put on the internet. What does all of this mean? Who owns it? Does anyone own it? Should we be more protective of what we put up there? All of that seems to be, I feel like, coming to a boiling point. And I couldn't have predicted, and there are people who are a lot smarter than me that I'm sure could have, but I couldn't have predicted 2 years ago that no one would be talking about blockchain and just everyone would be talking about AI. Who knows? Maybe there's something else, that I'm ignorant about that will sort of upend this. But it does feel like right now that's the topic that everyone's sort of obsessed with and kind of nervous about.
Well, I'm going to be in New York next month at an NFT conference, and it looks like the full slate of talks revolve around AI. And so, I mean, it was really funny. Last year, when the crypto NFT market crashed for a while, and there's been a bit of a rebound, but when it crashed, all of that NFT technical brain power, all of those engineers kind of moved from NFT companies into forming AI companies. And it kind of followed venture capital also.
90% of tech investments are going towards AI. Like, you need the letters AI on your deck. You know what I mean? In some capacity. right now, you know? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, but that's exactly the point I was going to make, was that a venture capital is pouring money into AI. So all those NFT people were, and I mean, there are some that have kind of stayed the course, and it's, purely what it was a couple of years ago. But you see a lot of modifications of business plans, and, a lot of migration of intellectual power from focusing on what are we going to do with the blockchain to how are we going to use AI, right? And so...
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Listen, the promise is, I guess, that it's going to completely change our world, and it doesn't seem like for the better overall. But again, trying to keep a positive attitude about it. And they're obviously not mutually, they're not separate in any way. I mean, things can be both AI and have blockchain components. I was impressed. I was in San Francisco, in October. And I was impressed, I have to say. That's not my general, crew. I don't hang out a lot with venture capitalists, so it's not like I get a lot of this feedback. So it was interesting to be with many of them. That the sense, at least at the time, that I was getting from all of them was that they are still very bullish about blockchain. Mm-hmm. And they still very much think that technology is revolutionary and that it is not going anywhere, but that it is still, it's not ready for mass market. And that I guess they're sort of, waiting till the time comes when it is. But there's still belief in that conceptually. Now, when it comes to, NFTs and fine art and stuff like that, maybe there's less of that. Right. But as an underlying technology, the premise of it, I think it's still very, very attractive to people. It's very attractive to me.
Now, I've always believed that blockchain answers so many of the burning issues that the art world has had for a number of years. But, like conversations I've had on panel discussions is a question of, how does that legacy art world feel about the transparency of the blockchain? And I think that's the reason why a company like Arcule, who's, founded by the folks behind Art Basel, why they are promoting a blockchain that is proprietary instead of open. And so that you get to see that information on a need-to-know basis instead of being fully transparent. And maybe the art world with a capital A would be more likely to adopt something that's a little bit more opaque.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've even talked about it with not even, only relegated to the art world, but think about big brands as well. I mean, I mentioned Samsung before, so I'll just stick with that example. I don't think that they would be comfortable with us having, the contract and everything visible to everyone. It's unrealistic to think visibility in business is, the thing that is going to solve things. I think you need to keep some things kind of behind closed doors, but also there's an incredible amount that can be, exposed through that and just have a finer point on it. Like this is, in the example of Arcule or Fairchain as well, which has, a similar offering. It's wonderful to have a work that is kind of definitively the digital standard of the work, that one knows that. I think that that's a really clever way to, to encourage artists to put their works on chain like that, so that is the definitive. That is not something that anybody would think that that's undermining their privacy, wherein I think business dealings, yeah, you're absolutely right. And the art world certainly does not like transparency.
Well, Katarina, I really appreciate how transparent you have been today. I appreciate you being willing to sit down and open up on a Thursday afternoon. And man, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I love this. Have me back on anytime. Everyone, please come check out ARSNL.art. We have some fabulous stuff on there for sale. And yeah, for any artist or anyone else, get in touch for Artist Rights Society. Signing up is always free. Membership is free. And we'd love to have you.
Wonderful. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.